Hello, welcome back. We are in Leviticus 19, and if somebody sent you to this and this is your first video, go back to the beginning, or a lot of this isn't going to make any sense. I am pretty weird, but I'm going to seem even more weird if you start here. But I also encourage you to ask questions, debate. Hey, the mailman just went by. I told you it was distracting sometimes, but uh, I want you to talk about this with somebody who follows God, is a believer, and understands the Word of God. I don't want you to beat anybody over the head. Nobody's been trying to deceive you or lie to you or cheat you or anything like that. It's just the time it takes to understand this stuff is too long for a 30-minute sermon. Nobody's going to watch that sermon. I know, I've preached it and people are like, hey, it was great, but I didn't understand. It takes a while. Also, some of this stuff is hard to understand. It's complex, but it's teaching us principles and patterns that are going to flow into the New Testament. And the New Testament is going to open up for you like never before. And I think when we're done, you're going to agree with me that Leviticus is probably the best book in the Bible. Now, it's at the center of the Torah. So you have Genesis and Exodus, then Leviticus, then you have Numbers and Deuteronomy. So it is the heart of the Torah. It's where it kind of comes together. And we're going to get into Numbers and Deuteronomy next. But for now, we're in Leviticus chapter 19. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. It's a little easier to understand. And we're going to knock down some maybe customs, traditions, or things you thought didn't apply. You might find out they do apply. So let's see what we're doing. Again, this is not about your salvation. This is not about whether you go to heaven or hell. This is about how to live after you're saved. So if you don't do all of this stuff, it does not mean that you're not saved. This is just how God intends for us to live after. Now, there's no temple. You can't sacrifice, those kind of things. But you also don't have to, because we now fully understand what Jesus' sacrifice was. And this is where we find that out. So it's not about guilt. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about learning what God really, truly wants for us and how we're supposed to live. So let's go. The Lord also said to Moses, give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must show great respect for your mother and father, and you must also, what? You must always observe my Sabbath days of rest. I am the Lord your God. Do not put your trust in idols or make metal images of gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a peace offering to the Lord, offer it properly so you will be accepted by God. The sacrifice must be eaten on the same day you offer it or on the next day. Whatever is left over until the third day must be completely burned up. If any of the sacrifice is eaten on the third day, it will be contaminated and I will not accept it. Anyone who eats it on the third day will be punished for defiling what is holy to the Lord and will be cut off from the community. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall on the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal, do not deceive or cheat one another. Excuse me. Do not defraud or rob a neighbor. Do not bring shame on the name of your God by using it to swear falsely. I am the Lord. Do not make your hired workers wait until the next day to receive their pay. Do not insult the deaf or cause the blind to stumble. You must fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. Do not stand idly by while your neighbor's life is threatened. I am the Lord. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Confront people directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You must obey all my decrees. Do not mate two different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two different kinds of seeds. Do not wear clothing woven from two different kinds of thread. We're going to get into that, I promise. You probably always wondered why that was the thing. We'll explain it. If a man has sex with a slave girl whose freedom has never been purchased, but who is committed to become another man's wife, he must pay full compensation to her master. But since she is not a free woman, neither the man nor the woman will be put to death. The man, however, must bring a ram as a guilt offering and present it to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will then purify him before the Lord with the ram of the guilt offering, and the man's sin will be forgiven. When you enter the land and plant fruit trees, leave the fruit unharvested for the first 3 years and consider it forbidden. Do not eat it. In the 4th year, the entire crop must be consecrated to the Lord as a celebration of praise. Finally, in the 5th year, you may eat the fruit. If you follow this pattern, your harvest will increase. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat meat that has been drained of its blood. Do not eat meat that has not been drained of its blood. Do not practice fortune telling or witchcraft. Do not trim off the hair on your temples or trim your beards. Do not cut your bodies for the dead, and do not mark your skin with tattoos. I am the Lord. Do not defile your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will be filled with prostitution and wickedness. Keep my Sabbath days of rest and show reverence towards my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not defile yourselves by turning to mediums or those who consult the spirits of the dead. I am the Lord your God. Stand up in the presence of the elderly and show respect for the aged. Fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or volume. Your scales and weights must be accurate, so quit cheating on your weight. I'm sorry, that's a terrible joke, but your scales and weights must be accurate. Your containers for measuring dry materials or liquids must be accurate. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You must be careful to keep all my decrees and regulations by putting them into practice. I am the Lord your God. So we're told in verse 2, not in the Living Translation because it's been Englishized to make it a little easier to read, but in the complete Jewish version, it says, you shall be holy, for I, Yahweh, am holy. Being holy as God means that we're supposed to imitate God. And the purpose of our human will is to express moral decisions according to God's laws and commands, not our own personal preferences. Holiness is an inner condition that must be expressed outwardly to have any weight. It doesn't do any good if it just stays inside of you. For us to claim holiness, but because of our relationship with Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, but to live as though our actions are separate from that, separate from our inner holiness, that just makes us hypocrites. So it's like I'm holy and I'm living holy as far as that goes, but I can make decisions that are not holy. And we all do that. That's a battle we fight, putting that old nature to rest. And in verse 4, it says, do not turn to. And that's a Hebrew idiom, which it means not to call on the power of an idol or a false god for help. And, sometimes we think it doesn't really matter, but, we're talking to the football gods or to the nature gods or whatever it is. God is God. And all the rest of them are false gods. So in verse 5, we see the Ziva Shalamim. The kind of offering must be done exactly the way it says and eaten on the first day. We saw that in Leviticus 7. In other words, that person will either be excommunicated, kicked out, or executed. The Shilamim class of offerings were the most common. So the rules were very strict. The worshiper could perform the sacrifice as often as they wanted to, and they got to keep that portion of the meat for themselves. The reason the consequences are so strict is because it's the most common. So if everybody does it, everybody will start to do it the easier way. So we compromise some of God's rule because it's just more convenient. And he says, if somebody does that, kick them out or execute them. Then it won't happen anymore. So whatever animal sacrificed has its ownership officially transferred to God the moment when hands are laid on its head and our sin is put on that animal. it becomes holy property. So when we don't use it right, we are violating his holy property, and the consequence of that is death. So verses 9 and 10 deal with the poor. These commands would not take effect for many years because they didn't have any crops. They didn't farm for like another 40 years. They're still in the desert at this point. So they're being told what they need to do when they get to the promised land. The second part of, many of these won't have any meaning whatsoever until they get there because they're in the desert. The second part of the command is that the owner should not gather the gleanings. And in Hebrew, it's leket. Leket is the gleanings, the things that kind of fell on the ground as you're harvesting, and then the ones on the hard corners of your land. He says just leave that for the poor. That way they can just have access to it. And remember, there were no food banks. There wasn't a McDonald's. There wasn't cheap food around. You had to grow food if you weren't going to eat. And we'll see this in the book of Ruth. That's basically what's happening there. So who were the poor? These were desperate people, not lazy people, because God didn't tolerate laziness in his society. People like foreign merchants that were just in town for a little while, a foreign soldier that was maybe passing through or came to find work. It meant someone who either had no intention or ability to become part of the Israeli nation. So they were just passing through. So in verse 11, the topic switches to civil law. Leviticus 19 is kind of seen as a Torah within a Torah because it expounds on principles that we've already talked about, either in Exodus or in the beginning of Leviticus. And that's why I said go back to the beginning, because some of these will sound like new rules, and they're not. They're really just expounded and expanded previous rules. So getting the best deal by lying and cheating and holding back information was very positive in Arab countries. It still is. And Jehovah says his set apart people are not to do this kind of thing, that they're supposed to deal honestly and fairly. So Jehovah didn't invoke his name. It says don't invoke his name if you have no intention of carrying it out. And there are so many times when you, and especially raising kids, you hear, I swear to God that's true. It's like, don't do that, especially if it's not true. But he says, that's a terrible thing to do. So verse 13 defines God's idea of fairness, justice, and truthfulness. Every rule, law, or command is the unveiling of goodness and righteousness. So all of that is opposite. That is opposite of that is evil. So those are the two. If we see separation, division, and that's really important because in God's economy, it's good versus evil. The principle behind the law of gleaning is pretty easy to apply. We're to budget for charity. If we have a large field, we give. If we have a small field, we give. If we see a greater need, we give more. Never in the Bible is there an allowance by Jehovah to stop giving. We're supposed to budget that in, whether we have a little money or a lot of money. One of my favorite people in the world used to give $5 a week, and she's a student, she's young, and I just loved that because she followed that command. I want to give whether I have a lot or a little, and someday she's going to have a lot, so she's going to be amazing. Verse 13 speaks of fraud and robbery. In that era, the person who earned that money would use it immediately to buy food for his family. So withholding overnight meant people went to bed hungry. So a field owner who holds their wages overnight, God calls that fraud. Don't do that. To take advantage of a person's weakness, too, is seen as a violation of the command about someone who is deaf or blind. That deaf person may not know, or the blind person, but Jehovah knows, and he speaks on behalf of those who are powerless. So don't do those kind of things. Justice is the focus of verses 15 and 16, expanding and building on those 10 basic commands, the 10 words that we studied back in in Exodus that we call the 10 Commandments. Over time, he introduces little nuances and deeper understanding of their application and their meaning. And that's why when you begin from the beginning, you get all that full picture. If you begin at the end, you get just kind of a shadow of that. So at first, these rules seem like a list of do's and don'ts, but God is actually teaching Israel to imitate him. God is teaching Israel what holiness is and what holy behavior looks like. The point is that once a nation begins to mete out justice based on the rich or the poor or on class, then God's definition of justice is not served anymore. And he does not show favoritism to the poor, nor does he show disdain for the rich. His justice is based on the will given to follow the ways of holiness, or you're following the ways of evil. So the will to love God or to not. So to follow his way is righteousness, and to not is evil. So a brother in this sense is a fellow Israelite. It's a member of the same society. It's common now, especially, to live next door to people and not even know their name. But that wouldn't have happened in Israel society because they were all in tents next to each other. And the idea is that we should not be angry with someone and just let it fester in our hearts, but we should confront them, tell them honestly and lovingly. And despite the outcome, you are not to seek revenge or vengeance or to allow bitterness to just sit in your heart. We all struggle with that one, but it always goes away when we just go confront them and talk to them. That's the Bible says that many, many times throughout. Don't just sit around and be mad at somebody. Even Jesus repeated this concept in Matthew 22:37, and he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." That's what Jesus said. So love your neighbor as yourself is the central principle of the Torah. Verse 19 revolves around a word that we learned last time, tevel. And tevel means confusion, often translated as perversion. But the commandment of verse 19 is literal. So the idea is that a goat should not be bred with a donkey or a sheep with a goat. Then we are told not to plant different crops in the same field. The most common would have been to sow grain crop in the rows between the grapevines. And finally, threads are not to be mixed. Now remember, they're still in the desert. They're not going to do any of this stuff for 40 years, but they thought they were pretty close to being there. Also, they had never done any of this stuff. They were basically just tending to whatever the Egyptians told them to do. They didn't have to put a lot of thought process. They were slaves. So they had a slave mentality. But God is setting boundaries. Boundaries are the result of one of God's most fundamental governing dynamics. And that is that Jehovah divides, elects, and separates from the holy from the unholy, and the clean from the unclean. And even though we may not understand some of that, if he divided it, leave it divided. Don't try to mix it. So man loves to blur distinctions and boundaries. We like to just break boundaries. Tolerance, moral relativism, same-sex marriage, all of those are breaking boundaries that God set up. So it is the removal of Torah from the church that has allowed for man-made doctrines as our source of truth. To pronounce the things God calls evil as good, that God who he says they're not good, so the God that never changes changed. And that doesn't make any sense to me. Like I know why we did it, but we shouldn't have done it. So we are not to redesignate things that God calls evil as good. We're not to replace God's laws with philosophies called doctrines. To do any of these things is to create tevel, confusion, perversion. Deuteronomy 22:5 says, "A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor a man put on a woman's clothing. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Pretty clear. Deuteronomy 22:9 says, "You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest all the produce of the seed which you have sown and the increase of the vineyard become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together." So there are three types of mixing. First is sowing grain in a vineyard. This is considered the most extreme example. The second category is harnessing an ox and a donkey together, yoking together two inherently different creatures to perform some sort of work. So it is not that the attributes of either species is altered or changed. It's that the function of each that they were created for to perform was altered due to the improper mixing by men. So basically, God set it down, and we said, well, it really doesn't matter that much. We can do it anyway. And God says, don't do it. We don't have to always understand the why. We just have to look for the pattern. And if God said don't, we don't. So the third category, mixing of wool and linen, is a middle ground between the first two categories. It's simply God's sovereign decision as to what improper mixing is. So we can search for the why all day long, and we're never going to find it. But He didn't choose to tell us why. So we just have to accept it. It's a pattern. So that leads men to decide that if they can't find a logical why, then there's no longer any reason to obey that command. We see that concerning homosexuality and gay marriage. What harm does it cause? What two people do in private is their business, but we're still changing what God told us not to do. So my advice is to focus on the patterns and how one pattern relates to the next. And then your understanding of who God is, how He operates, and what He expects of us will increase, and your frustration will decrease if we just look for the patterns. So an example of what you call a kalayim is the improper mixing. Is no improper mixing is also in 2 Corinthians 6:14. It says, do not yoke yourselves together in a team of unbelievers. How can righteousness and lawlessness be partners? I don't know why my mouth's getting in the way today. What fellowship does light have with darkness? So by paying attention to the patterns, we see that what Paul does is he takes a command from the physical realm into the spiritual heavenly realm it was intended for. So knowing this pattern, we start to see how this opens up to something bigger than just focusing on two things. So there's a boundary established by God between righteousness and unrighteousness, light and darkness. Verses 20 and 22 are one thought we assumed happened often, because a slave girl is a Hebrew girl owned by a Hebrew man. So most of the slave girls owned by Israelites were Israelite girls, but they weren't supposed to do any of that stuff. And in Exodus 21, 7 through 11 makes it lawful for a father to sell his daughter into what we would call bond servitude. So basically to pay off a debt or something like that. It was usually the result of poverty or a family being in debt, and the girl was used as the payment. But this was not a girl in chains or used for sexual pleasures. The law insisted that she be treated well. So she couldn't be treated like a slave. She was really more of an employee. Hey, she's going to go work for you for a year to pay off this debt. That was the system kind of created. So when the girl matured and got to the marrying age, generally 15 years old or more, he had an obligation to either marry her himself or give her to his son for marriage, or allow her to be redeemed out of that and the debt forgiven. So if a man came along and seduced the girl, there was a problem. The problem was that the girl was now damaged goods. She wasn't a virgin anymore. The future husband was expecting a virgin, so the girl's owner would be out money he had expected. So the idea is that a man who seduced the slave girl was responsible to pay the full agreed price. The slave owner would have confronted the seducer, made a claim, and demanded reparations. So according to verse 21, the seducer had to make a sacrifice to be forgiven. He had to make reparations, but he also had to be forgiven by God. Not only had he devalued the property of the slave owner, he trespassed against Jehovah by violating a command. So Asham was established in order to make atonement for committing a sinful act, and it was fairly expensive. We learned about that one in an earlier chapter. So the seducer paid a price for his lust, and he didn't get the girl. He would have to cough up an additional bride price because the money he paid to the slave owner was a penalty, not a purchase price. In verse 23, we get another law that will not take effect for a while because it involves farming. When Israel plants fruits for the first 3 years, none of the fruit's produce is to be eaten because of the pruning that is necessary to get the tree to mature and be even more productive. So for the first 3 years, the branches are to be heavily pruned so the trees will be better producers in the long run. In the 4th year, a good harvest can be expected, and the harvest is considered holy, set apart for Jehovah, and is given to him. It is all burned up, probably eaten by the Levites and the priest if it's not all burned up. Then in the 5th year, normal harvesting could begin. So the trees would become better producers over their lifetime, but they had to wait 5 years. Usually we don't want to wait 5 minutes. So eating things with blood and fortune telling were kind of Canaanite norms. And the law is there to combat that pagan practice. God didn't want anything associated with them to be associated with the Hebrews. So if you want to honor me, observe my Sabbaths and have the utmost respect for the tabernacle, God's earthly dwelling place. So once again, we're reminded we're supposed to observe his Sabbaths. I'm not sure why we don't, but we don't. Verse 31 means do not attempt communication with the spirits. The problem is a person who thinks they can communicate with the spirits is really communicating with the demon. And a demon is not the spirit of a dead person. So don't do any of that stuff. Chapter 19 lays out what a holy life looks like for God's people. We can't talk about Yeshua living in our heart at the same time denying we need to live a holy life. We are the temple we're supposed to be protecting. So in verse 32, God says, respect the elderly. It means to honor by taking care of them and seeing to their needs. It also means appreciated and not ignored. Don't do the bare minimum. Protect their coming and going. Allow them dignity in what they are going through on a daily basis. To prepare for the time when Yeshua would come and offer Gentiles, foreigners, strangers, you and I, by means of faith in him, to join Israel in a spiritual sense. Sorry, I skipped a line. A duty to treat foreigners fairly and allow those that wanted to give up their foreign gods to join Israel and make the God of the universe their God. That was to prepare. It's a pattern to prepare us for when Yeshua offered it to all foreigners. So he's setting up, planting those seeds so he can bring it to a fullness. The word we learned in Acts was pleru. He came to pleru the law. And that means to fill up. The reason Israel is to do this is because God says to love him as you love yourself. Verse 34, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Part of the reason for the Egyptian experience was to learn one of those lessons was that the foreigners were as valuable in God's eyes as they were. So they had to go through it. That was the pattern he was setting them up for. And if they learned it and they paid attention to it, Gentiles accepting Yeshua would make perfect sense. Verses 35 and 36 tell us that the Israelites, that they are not to cheat one another. It is, like I said, Middle Eastern culture to cheat or get over on somebody is considered a good thing. And God's people are to emulate God, be fair and just to all. So this chapter ends with God's reminder to follow all of his laws and commands, not just the convenient ones. And remember, God does the opposite. He gives more than he takes. So not only does God not cheat you, he gives you way more than you deserve. He gave me way more than I deserved, and that's how he operates. So we're not supposed to be out there cheating other people. When we're given more than we deserve, we should share that. So that's Leviticus chapter 19. Like I said, it's kind of a Torah within a Torah within a Torah, if you want to look at it that way. Russian nesting dolls, I think it's called. But God bless. Share this with somebody you love that you want to know God more, and hopefully they'll sign up and come along with us. We're going to jump right into Leviticus chapter 20 next. God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.